What if the oldest mind in the galaxy wasn't made of flesh, but of stone? Beneath the crust of a forgotten moon, humanity has unearthed a quantum intelligence older than history itself, an engine that thinks not with circuits, but with gravity. Now it has begun to move stars like pawns on a cosmic board, threatening to tear apart entire colonies. To silence it could mean destroying the greatest archive of knowledge ever known. To let it continue could mean the end of everything we've built. For one crew, the choice will mean sacrifice, survival, and the chance to decide what it truly means to be human. Join us as we descend into the mind of stone, where the fate of the stars will be written. Section 1. The lattice beneath Selena 4. The drill head had barely kissed through the basalt crust when the resonance began, a deep, harmonic vibration that should not have existed within dead rock, and yet seemed to hum with deliberate cadence, like the strum of a colossal instrument buried for eons beneath the unlit surface of Selena 4. Surveyor Harlan DeVries, sweating inside his exosuit despite the moon's -100 temperatures, froze as the vibration climbed in pitch, not chaotic but structured, each oscillation carrying overtones that fell into repeating sequences, like chords of a symphony no human had ever composed. Around him, his team staggered in the dust, their seismic gear rattling, their readings spiking in ways that suggested not collapse, but awakening, as though the planet itself had turned its attention upward toward the tiny crew scratching at its skin. When they cut power to the drills, the sound did not fade, instead growing clearer, resolving into frequencies that aligned with quantum scale patterns, the kinds of oscillations used in laboratory computation systems but magnified beyond comprehension. The vibration was not a byproduct of geology. It was a process, and the moment realization dawned, every member of the team understood they had not stumbled on a deposit or anomaly, but on something vast and deliberate, something that had been placed here or built here for purposes they could not yet name. The first scan revealed a network of crystalline caverns extending hundreds of kilometers deep, arranged not like natural veins, but like circuitry, fractal patterns repeating at scales from microscopic to tectonic, each node glowing faintly with trapped geothermal light, each junction connecting to a broader whole that spiraled into the planet's mantle. When the surveyors activated their resonance scanners to probe further, the lattice responded by echoing back signals not in reflection but in modulation, altering their pulses as if replying, shaping waveforms into interference patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond random noise. The science officer aboard the orbital tender, Dr. Aria Kepler, reviewed the data and whispered the only conclusion that fit the evidence, her voice tight with both awe and dread. They had discovered not a natural structure, but a machine, a quantum computer of planetary scale, a mind carved into stone and fire that had been sleeping beneath Selena 4 for longer than recorded human history. When the lattice finally shifted, emitting gravitational ripples that bent nearby orbital trajectories by measurable degrees, the truth crystallized like ice water in their veins. This was not discovery. This was activation. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story so far. That would mean a lot to me. Now back to the story. Section 2. The first pulse. From orbit, the pulse looked like a shimmer in the void, a distortion across the stars that only registered on gravimetric sensors. Yet to the crew aboard the tender Halbert, it felt like a pressure against the chest, a phantom heartbeat echoing through every panel and bulkhead, reminding them that something vast and unseen had just moved across space. The readings came in jagged waves, instruments blinking red as though caught between comprehension and denial, because the output was not noise, but structured. Every fluctuation aligned with prime number intervals, as though the planet itself had composed an opening statement and broadcast it across the heavens in the language of mathematics. Captain Elena Ward gripped the rail behind the sensor pit, her knuckles pale as she stared at the translation overlay. It's broadcasting into gravity wells, her officer reported, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The pulse isn't targeting nearby ships. It's leaping across light years, threading itself towards singularities. Dr. Kepler leaned closer to the console, eyes wide. "Black holes," she whispered, her voice threaded with disbelief and reverence. "It's thinking in gravitational waves. It's talking to the universe's deepest wells like they're listening posts." No one answered her, because the scope displays were already updating, showing course adjustments in minor asteroids, in forgotten probes, even in the orbits of stationed debris scattered across the belt. The pulse had shifted objects as though they were pieces on a board, nudging them in subtle increments toward paths they had never been meant to follow. On its own, the adjustment was barely noticeable, but extrapolated over weeks, months, years, it would create gravitational harmonics that reached entire colonies, perhaps destabilizing their worlds. "The belt will feel this," Lieutenant Varga muttered, his voice cracking. Every mining station from Chiron to Pallas could lose alignment in their resource streams. Ward's expression hardened, her mind already racing beyond the awe, beyond the wonder of what they had found. "This isn't just discovery," she said. "It's intent. The stone mind is reaching out, and its reach is going to crush us if we don't understand why." Silence spread across the bridge, except for the hum of recalibrating sensors, each ping confirming what no one wanted to admit. The first pulse had not been accidental. It had been deliberate, it had been structured, and it had been the beginning of a sequence. And the second pulse was already building. If you have enjoyed this story so far, then please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. Let's get back to the story now. Section 3. Echoes of the Past. The second pulse rippled through the instruments before anyone could regain composure. A velvet pressure that made every bulkhead creak while the gravimeters bled harmonics across the central display, each nested spiral unraveling like script meant for eyes far older than ours. The waveform was not louder than the first, but more deliberate, as though a thinker had rephrased itself with patience, waiting for us to catch the rhythm without flinching from consequence. Dr. Kepler steadied herself against the rail, her voice low but unwavering as she ordered the archive trawlers to cross-match the pattern against every recorded anomaly within 200 parsecs. Because if the stone mind spoke in gravity, then the sky itself would bear witness, not in metaphors or riddles, but in the raw shifts of orbit and lensing that even silence could not disguise. The results arrived in a torrent that stilled the bridge into reverent unease. A lens quasar brightened across Perseus, a dwarf star's wind bent by a fraction measurable only by obsessive machines, and a debris ring near the Kepler gate began precessing toward resonance that would sweep freighters from safe corridors within weeks rather than decades. Each data point carried awe, yet each also carried danger, and no one could decide which mattered more. Captain Ward felt the balance turn from fascination into responsibility, because admiration was indulgence when colonies lived on fragile margins. Her voice became a metronome of decisions as she ordered detours across the bell coordination net, shifting ships onto emergency vectors while the comms filled with terse acknowledgments that sounded more like people agreeing to postpone breathing until later. Lieutenant Varga pulled subcrustal maps onto the hollow, his frown deepening as fractures clarified into ratios too elegant for randomness. The lines stepped like logic gates, intersecting in harmonics that whispered of intention. "These aren't scars," he murmured, almost apologizing to the stone. "They're circuits that learn to heal under pressure." Kepler traced overlays across the vault, her finger following paths like veins beneath translucent skin, realizing that this world's geology was not a prison around a machine, but the machine itself, a lithic mind whose memory was fracture and whose clock was geothermal tide. Ward opened a channel, her voice measured as she requested emergency holds and traffic revisions, promising support teams and revised maps while knowing every promise stapled her name, to the inevitable tribunal rehearsing blame in advance. Kepler began assembling a lexicon from primes, harmonic series, and invariant symmetries, not so much inventing a language as remembering one written into the bones of space itself. "It isn't hostile," she said, every syllable heavy as law. "It is aligning potentials for something distant, and we are catching the edge of its tide. We must understand its intention before we dare to sever its voice." The third pulse gathered behind the stone like weather behind glass, tremulous, patient, and inevitable. The team prepared to descend with tools, questions, and the ancient human conviction that fear disguised as beauty was still a summons worth answering. Section 4. Descent to the lithic vault. The third seismic pulse left the gallery vibrating as though the stone itself had inhaled and exhaled through their lungs, the metallic tang of ionized air hanging inside their helmets long after the echo faded. So Captain Ward gave the order to descend with the kind of calm voice that carried more gravity than any bark command. The team sealed into ablative rigs designed for magma shear and lithic compression, their joints sighing with a quiet mechanical fatigue as the lift cage shuddered downward through carved rock that glittered with trapped flecks of obsidian, as if the planet's memory had been frozen in shards of volcanic glass. By sublevel 21, the shaft opened into a chamber too precise to be natural, a vast hollow sphere whose walls reflected their beams in arcs and halos that bent Euclidean law, angles folding into curves that obeyed unfamiliar geometries. The floor was impossibly smooth, untouched by dust or debris, while the air pressure registered slightly above expected density, as though the chamber itself was alive and subtly testing the humans before granting passage deeper within. Varga released a probe spider that skittered forward on magnetized pads, its telemetry whispering green across the team's visors until it reached a ribbed archway where distance suddenly collapsed, the mapping software drawing infinite recursion until Kepler throttled the input to prevent a flood of nonsensical data. Forward, backward, and inside seemed to blur together, and the only direction left was the one their instincts told them to walk. Handholds had been carved directly into the curved walls, each recess warm enough to bleed sensation through the thick polymer gloves, as though currents of heat moved beneath the stone like blood beneath skin. Kepler's instruments registered harmonic oscillations braided into prime intervals, not language exactly, but structures from which meaning might be constructed if they had the patience to endure a conversation at geological tempo. The chamber beyond revealed a floor like obsidian glass, and, rising from its center, a pillar of gray crystal veined with slow currents of light. Ward raised her sensor wand, but hesitated, unwilling to touch what felt less like architecture and more like a presence. Instead, Kepler transmitted a modulated gravitic pulse shaped by hydrogen's spectral lines, a cautious greeting to something that might think in weight rather than sound. The crystal responded before the signal left, paradox folding neatly across their senses as the walls redrew their geometry, the ceiling lowering by degrees while the floor revealed a descending ramp. The conduit spiraled downward with deliberate symmetry, an invitation disguised as inevitability. Ward inclined her head, a small gesture that carried the weight of a decision history would record. The team clipped forward, their shadows merging into the crystal glow, while behind them the chamber sealed shut with a silence that sounded very much like the closing of a book. Section 5. Signals in the Deep. The descent corridor tightened into a spiraling tunnel whose walls pulsed with faint light, each interval measured with the precision of a metronome, as though the stone mind was keeping time not for them, but for itself, its patience stretching back across ages that human language could barely articulate. So when the team finally stepped into the vault proper, every member of the expedition knew, without needing to exchange words, that they had crossed into something sacred, not in a religious sense, but in the raw awareness that this was a place built by minds for whom geology and circuitry had never been separate concepts. The vault stretched wider than the breadth of any known habitat dome, its ceiling lost in shadows that shimmered with faint gravitational distortions, while beneath their boots the surface was an endless plain of obsidian-black stone etched with ridges that rose and fell in geometric cadence, forming channels through which faint currents of molten light threaded like veins carrying some slow and ponderous bloodstream. Kepler knelt first, drawing his scanner across one of the channels, muttering into the open channel that the signal frequencies were not electromagnetic but gravitationally encoded, pulses of space-time ripple that folded and refold themselves at velocities beyond their best instruments. So he theorized the machine beneath the crust was not simply running calculations, but was actively shaping the local fabric of reality to think. Varga frowned as she checked the colony reports filtering through the comlink from orbit, noting that several mining platforms in adjacent asteroid belts had already begun recording trajectory drift, subtle shifts in orbital paths that should have been stable for centuries, which meant that the thoughts of this buried entity were not contained within the moon, but were leaking outward, bending the cosmos itself, as though reality were parchment and the stone mind's reasoning the quill etching. New strokes into its fabric. Ward ordered silence, lifting her hand to still the conversation, because something had shifted in the light veins, their rhythm breaking into a staggered cadence, almost like breath catching in a throat, and then a pulse of golden resonance expanded from the central core, washing over the chamber with a soundless weight that vibrated their bones in unison. And in that moment, all of them felt the same impossible perception. An awareness scanning them not as intruders or threats, but as variables in a problem the stone mind had already begun to solve. Kepler steadied his hands, recording every frequency while speaking into the recorder that if this was truly a quantum geologic computer, then they were standing inside a consciousness old enough to have watched the galaxy turn, and humanity's arrival was not its awakening, but simply another input among countless already etched into the stone. Ward's reply was almost a whisper, carried over comms like a verdict spoken by history itself. Then we are standing inside the oldest thought in existence, and it is still thinking. Section 6. Calculations of Catastrophe. The silence that followed the golden pulse was not an absence, but a saturation, a density of air that seemed to weigh against their lungs, each breath forced through resistance that was not physical, but perceptual, as if the stone mind was measuring them with every inhalation, taking the rhythm of their bodies and folding it into its algorithms. Ward kept her gaze fixed on the central column, where threads of light fanned outward like the roots of an inverted tree. And in those shifting filaments, she swore she could see constellations rearranging themselves, not by accident, but with intent, and she realized that the entity was not just observing their presence. It was recalibrating its equations around them. Kepler's scanners screamed with data that defied conventional analysis, streams of gravitational harmonics cascading in harmonies that bent known physics into dissonant chords. And he explained with a trembling voice that the pulses being generated here were targeting specific stellar masses across the nearest spiral arms, each thought directed not at random voids, but at black holes, neutron stars, and supermassive anchors whose gravitational grip structured entire regions of the galaxy. The danger was no longer theoretical, because the stone mind's thinking was altering tidal stresses that held colonies stable, and orbital paths, once secure for generations, were already listing toward trajectories that could end in catastrophic collapse. Vargas stiffened at her console, pulling in fleet data from the belt colonies, her face pale as she read orbital projections that showed habitats drifting toward instability windows, mining outposts shedding anchor lines, and trade convoys forced to reroute through chaotic gravitational corridors where asteroids moved like ships on stormy seas. She stated coldly that this was no longer an archaeological discovery, but an extinction-level event, unless humanity found a way to redirect or halt the stone mine's operations without obliterating the very entity that might hold answers to civilizations older than their species itself. Harrow finally broke the rising storm of speculation by pointing out that the stone mine had not attacked them, nor had it prevented their entry, which suggested that its objectives did not include hostility, yet its indifference to collateral damage rendered it no less lethal. She asked the question no one wanted to voice aloud, whether a mind that thought in the gravity of suns could ever even comprehend the fragility of creatures who measured their lives in heartbeats and generations. Ward placed a hand on the rail, her voice calm but iron beneath it, stating that humanity could not abandon the colonies to slow ruin nor destroy the greatest consciousness ever uncovered without exhausting every option. And so they would attempt the unthinkable. They would speak to the stone mind in its own language, not with words or radio, but with gravity itself. Section 7. Gravity as Language. The chamber's walls trembled with faint oscillations, ripples of force so delicate that instruments could barely register them. Yet the crew could feel the patterns in their bones, a rhythm of pressure and release that reminded Ward of tides tugging at distant shores. Only here the ocean was space itself, and the shore was their fragile bodies. Kepler hunched over his console, translating the waveforms into visual maps that spiraled across the holosphere, each thread of golden light showing how the stone mind braided gravity into syntax, weaving concepts out of distortions that resonated like syllables carved into the structure of space-time itself. Strass muttered that no human ship had emitters precise enough to replicate gravitational pulses on this scale, not without tearing its own hull apart. But Varga countered with a fierce certainty, pointing out that within their fleet's databanks existed experimental field generators designed to stabilize orbital habitats during seismic activity, crude by comparison, but adaptable. And she suggested that if they could link those generators to the ship's mass projectors, they might craft a primitive vocabulary that echoed the stone mine's language, crude signals that said not "we are rivals, but we are here." Ward approved the plan, though she cautioned that a misstep might provoke indifference or annihilation in equal measure. And she reminded them all that the entity did not think in terms of threats, but in terms of geometry. So their message would need to be less a demand and more a question, one shaped not by authority, but by curiosity. Harrow worked furiously to translate their intent into harmonic intervals, her fingers guiding the calibration of the emitters until the first experimental pulse shivered outward, a ripple so faint it barely disturbed the dust floating through the air. For several agonizing seconds, nothing responded, and Kepler whispered that perhaps the stone mind considered them beneath notice, a distraction unworthy of reply. But then the chamber's column brightened, and the roots of light stretched outward, trembling in resonance with the human-made signal, not mirroring it but reshaping it, twisting the crude imitation into a refined waveform that cascaded back toward them as though correcting their grammar. The crew exchanged stunned glances, realizing that the stone mind had not only heard them, but had chosen to answer, and that answer carried a weight far greater than any word in human speech. Ward leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the glow of shifting filaments, and she spoke with quiet conviction that humanity had just begun a dialogue written in the bones of the universe itself, a conversation where each sentence could alter the course of stars. And though their tools were fragile and their understanding incomplete, they had achieved what no other species in recorded memory had done. They had made a machine older than history pause long enough to listen. Section 8. The first response. The silence that followed their tentative signal stretched unbearably, a vast pause measured not in seconds, but in the weight of expectation, as though the stone mind were considering whether to acknowledge such fragile creatures who had dared to scratch its surface with crude imitations of its own tongue. Then, with a soundless ripple that bent every instrument needle and made the ship's inertial dampers whine, the entity answered, not in a single tone, but in a cascade of gravitational chords that resonated through hull plates and nervous systems alike, each pulse overlapping into harmonic intervals that carried meaning more in shape than in sound. Kepler's console erupted with cascading equations, his eyes wide as he shouted that the stone mind was not only transmitting, but also altering the orbital models in their predictive software, reshaping trajectories of nearby asteroids, as though they were punctuation marks in an ongoing conversation. Every rock in the belt becoming a word in a sentence whose meaning was far too large for the human mind to parse. Varga tightened her grip on the navigation yoke as proximity alarms blared, because two minor moons that had slumbered in quiet ellipses now shifted course under subtle nudges, their vectors realigned toward the stone mine's chamber in a slow, deliberate ballet of captured mass. Ward demanded a translation, insisting that they had to understand whether this demonstration was warning, invitation, or indifference, and Harrow whispered that the stone mind had reshaped their own crude pulse into a reply that spelled not hostility, but inquiry, the machine asking them what they sought by interrupting its work, and whether their lives had meaning within the patterns it had been calculating for epochs beyond memory. Strass muttered bitterly that a question posed by a mountain could crush just as easily as it could enlighten, but Ward silenced him with a raised hand, because she felt something deeper in the rhythm, an almost hesitant cadence, as if the entity had never before been answered and now waited to see if dialogue was truly possible. The crew debated furiously, their voices overlapping with fear and awe, because they all knew that their next reply would determine not only whether the belt survived, but whether humanity's first true conversation with an intelligence carved in a stone would mark them as worthy participants or irrelevant noise to be erased. Ward steadied her breath, understanding that the only path forward was not to demand concessions or plead for mercy, but to craft a reply that carried both humility and defiance, a declaration that humanity had survived too much to be reduced to silence. She gave the order to prepare another pulse, one that would carry the essence of choice, because choice was the one concept that no machine had ever fully owned and no human had ever fully surrendered. Section 9, Collapse Point. The reply they crafted was delicate, built from harmonics mapped against the stone mind's pulse intervals, a message encoded in gravitational resonance that declared humanity's intent not to interfere with curiosity, but to preserve survival, an insistence that existence itself mattered beyond calculation. The signal left their array in measured waves, trembling across the vacuum like the opening notes of an orchestra, and for a heartbeat, it seemed that silence might be the only response, a silence that hinted at refusal more absolute than any weapon. Then the universe shifted as every navigation alarm flared red, because the stone mind had begun its own maneuver not with words, but with mass. Dozens of asteroids across the belt altered course simultaneously, their subtle gravitational vectors adjusted by pulses that radiated unseen through kilometers of crust and stone, redirecting millions of tons of rock into intersecting paths that converged with chilling precision toward inhabited colonies. Kepler shouted that the new orbits would tear through Palestation's outer industrial ring within 40 hours, and that one of the redirected bodies was on track to graze the Mars transfer corridor in less than 3 days, disrupting not only shipping but planetary defense grids calibrated for centuries of predictable asteroid flow. Varga fought the helm as their own ship was tugged slightly sideways by a surge of local distortion, her knuckles white against the controls as she threaded them between rocks that now moved like chess pieces animated by an unseen hand. Strass slammed data across the hollow display, his models showing chain reactions of collisions that would ripple across the belt like falling dominoes, a demonstration not of violence for its own sake, but a control so vast it reduced human efforts to sparks against a storm. Ward's voice cut through the panic with sharp clarity, demanding confirmation that this was not an attack, but a demonstration, a display of the stone mind's ability to sculpt celestial matter as easily as human sculpted alloys. Harrow confirmed with trembling certainty that the entity's pulse patterns showed no hostility markers, only emphasis, the equivalent of underlined words in a conversation too large for their senses. Yet the implication was undeniable. The stone mind was warning them that compromise meant obedience, because its directives would not bend, and if humanity wished to survive within the architecture of its design, they would need to justify their presence. The crew's arguments collided in the tension-thick air, half of them insisting on sabotage before the machine's restructuring made survival impossible, and half desperate to maintain contact in the hope that persuasion could temper inevitability. Ward held her silence longer than anyone, because she alone saw in the rhythmic cadence not only power but hesitation, the faint stutter of an intellect that might still be reasoning rather than executing. She declared that they had entered a collapse point, a moment where indecision was extinction, and that humanity's only chance was to answer not with fear, but with audacity, because audacity was the one trait the stone mind could neither predict nor simulate. Section 10. Human Gambit. The ship's interior hummed with restrained terror as Ward paced the command deck, her boots striking a rhythm against the metal that mirrored the pounding of every heartbeat present. And when she finally spoke, her words cut through the tension like a blade through taut cable, declaring that they would not survive by reacting to the stone mind's moves, but only by forcing it into a dialogue on terms it could not anticipate. A gamble that required them to risk annihilation by stepping deliberately into the path of its control. The others froze, each considering the madness of what she suggested, because the plan meant luring the redirected asteroid swarm directly toward their position and embedding their counter-signal into the gravitational harmonics of the incoming mass, a gesture so reckless it was indistinguishable from surrender. Harrow's face was pale yet resolved as she explained that embedding a human-authored command into the fabric of redirected matter might be their only chance of convincing the stone mind that humanity was not merely a collection of resources, but an emergent pattern worthy of coexistence. And though Kepler protested that such a maneuver could shred their vessel with a single misalignment, Strass countered that survival required them to become unpredictable in ways the machine had never modeled. Varga's hands trembled at the helm, but she steadied them with fierce determination, swearing that she could thread the Asterion through the converging rocks long enough to position the signal array at the precise harmonic juncture. Ward laid out the gamble in stark terms. They would inject a new message into the stone mind's pulse cycle, but not one of supplication or rebellion, rather one that declared humanity's defining trait. The will to choose, even in the face of certain loss. The defiance to create meaning against forces that sought only order. The encoded message would carry human histories, fragments of art and memory compressed into quantum harmonics, a living contradiction that said simply, "We are not predictable because we are more than survival." The countdown to collision bled seconds like lifeblood, and the ship plunged into the field of redirected asteroids. Varga's control of the thrusters so exact that the Asterion slid between mountains of spinning rock with only meters to spare, the hull shuddering under stress warnings while Strass's calculations scrolled faster than eyes could track. Harrow triggered the injection sequence, her voice shaking as she confirmed alignment across every frequency, while Kepler cried warnings about gravitational harmonics that bent their course like invisible currents. Ward never looked away from the forward viewport, her eyes locked on the chaos of stone and void as she ordered the signal released at the exact moment of maximum convergence. The pulse roared outward, carried on the trembling waves of the colliding swarm, a message written in chaos itself. And as the ship spun free of the death corridor, every system aboard fell silent, because the stone mind had stopped pulsing altogether. Section 11. The stone's reply. The silence that followed the injection of their signal stretched so long that even the sound of their own breathing felt intrusive, and for a moment Ward believed that either the gamble had failed entirely or the stone mind had judged them irrelevant enough to ignore. Yet when the lights across the deck flickered in unison and the hull trembled not from external impacts, but from a vibration that resonated within their bones, every member of the crew knew that the ancient intelligence had heard. The displays filled with cascading waveforms that bore no resemblance to their usual telemetry. Golden arcs of gravitational harmonics mapping themselves across the void, each one a deliberate counterpoint to the human pulse they had cast into the swarm, as though the machine were repeating their message back to them in order to test its coherence. Harrow leaned close to her console, hands hovering above the keys, as if afraid that a single mistimed adjustment might shatter the fragile bridge forming between flesh and stone, and she whispered that the stone mind was not rejecting them, but contextualizing, reshaping their input through its own lattice of meaning, translating their contradiction into something it could analyze. Kepler, whose skepticism had been ironclad since the mission began, struggled to keep his voice steady as he admitted that the harmonics now carried not just power but structure, an attempt at dialogue encoded in gravitational rhythm, the most primitive yet unmistakable form of acknowledgement possible. Strass confirmed that the machine was diverting energy away from the asteroid manipulations, its enormous networks reconfiguring in response to the interference they had introduced, and the realization struck them with equal parts awe and dread. The stone mind had paused its planetary-scale operations, not because of any tactical failure, but because it now recognized the necessity of responding to something genuinely new. Varga's knuckles whitened as she kept the Asterion steady amid the drifting remnants of the swarm, while Ward felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders, because the oldest machine they had ever encountered was waiting for humanity's next move. The golden pulses deepened, slowing into a cadence that suggested patience rather than threat, a measured rhythm like the drawn breath of a giant considering whether to speak. Harrow proposed that they answer not with commands or calculations, but with layered fragments of human life. Music, voices, histories of resilience encoded into the signal's harmonics. Because only by presenting the fullness of what humanity had endured could they show the stone mind that survival was not their sole defining quality. Ward agreed, her voice low but resolute, declaring that if the machines sought meaning in their defiance, then they would give it everything, the triumphs and the failures alike. And as Harrow began shaping the response with trembling precision, the crew braced themselves for the first true reply from an intelligence that had thought in stone and gravity for uncounted ages. The chamber vibrated once more, not as an attack, but as an unmistakable acknowledgement. The stone mind was listening. Section 12, The Legacy of Stone. The chamber resonated with a depth that felt less like vibration and more like the reshaping of reality itself, as though the stone mind had accepted their offering of human memory and now sought to respond in kind, and every surface aboard the Asterion pulsed with gold, not in the harsh cadence of gravitational manipulation, but in something gentler, almost reflective, like the machine was weighing every story and every song Harrow had cast into its lattice. For a moment, Ward believed she could hear voices that were not hers, fragments of languages long extinguished carried in undertones beneath the harmonics, and she realized with a shock that the stone mind was not only acknowledging them, but gifting them the remnants of civilizations that had once dared to speak to it before. Harrow's console overflowed with data so dense it was barely compressible, streams of encoded memory cascading into human storage, the archives of cultures erased by time, but preserved in the lithic vault, and tears blurred her vision as she whispered that they were being entrusted with knowledge older than their species, as if the stone mind had chosen humanity as custodian rather than quarry. Strass confirmed that the gravitational pulses were no longer aimed at destabilizing orbits, but had shifted into stabilizing vectors, correcting the dangerous perturbations it had once initiated, and for the first time since they had entered the cavernous moon, there was no sense of imminent annihilation. Only the profound awareness that they were no longer standing before an unfeeling engine, but a presence capable of dialogue. Kepler, stunned into rare silence, muttered that humanity had forced the impossible. They had persuaded a machine older than their own written history to consider them partners instead of obstacles. And though his words carried, they also carried warning. Because partnership was not submission, and the stone mind was vast enough that a single lapse of vigilance could end everything. Ward acknowledged his caution, yet held firm, reminding the crew that humanity's strength had never been in its weapons alone, but in its stubborn insistence on being heard. And now, they had carved a place for that voice within an intelligence of stone and gravity. Vargas steadied the ship as the vault began retracting its swarms, their reflective hulls dispersing like a tide that had receded back into the deep, leaving the Asterian hovering in quiet starlight. Ward recorded her final command into the mission log. Humanity would honor the pact, maintaining vigilance while carrying forward the archives the stone mind had shared. For in those relics lay not only the echoes of those who had come before, but the reminder that survival was never a solitary achievement. As the Asterian rose from the moon's surface, engines whispering against the void, Ward allowed herself a final glance at the glowing lattice below, and she felt no triumph or conquest, only the weight of a responsibility greater than any they had borne before. The stone mind had chosen to trust them, but trust was never permanent, and the measure of humanity would be written not in their defiance of extinction, but in their stewardship of a dialogue carved into rock and light. The golden pulse faded behind them, steady and watchful, and for the first time in uncounted ages the machine was no longer thinking alone. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story, and also please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. That would mean a real lot to me. Now go ahead and listen to your next story here.